with 35 moves of the Anglo-Indian Defense after a brief hiatus. But first, a bit of poetry, as we do here at the Time Traveler Chess Channel, with a reading from Chapman's Homer. There is not a breath of air, not a peak, nor a glade, nor jutting headland, but it stands out in the ineffable radiance that breaks from the serene of heaven. The stars can all be told, and the heart of the shepherd is glad. Even thus shone the watchfires of the Trojans before Ilium, midway between the ships and the river Xanthus. 1,000 campfires on the plain, and in the glow of each sat 50 men, while the horses chomping on oats and corn behind their chariots waited for the dawn. There's, of course, Book 8 of the Iliad, and all you romanticists out there will, no doubt, catch the references and significance therein. This 35 move Anglo-Indian Defense had a bit of romanticism to it, ending as it did with pawn to rook 7. This pawn is going to promote, and no stopping it, up 2 pawns. Rook versus bishop and knight in game. A fun chess match. This opening, I am not sure I am prepared to fully analyze yet. We may see others like it in the future, but according to the computer analysis here on Lee Chess, did me no favors. Hung a knight on move 9 here. He has the knight pinned here on c6, and the move here is obviously to castle. I thought about this one quite a bit. I mean, we can look at the time histogram a little bit. Yeah, move 10 was a lengthy think for me, but ended up being the move somewhat obvious because you have to unpin your knight here. You don't want to move into a pin to begin with, but here was the only option after I supported this bishop with c5 on move 8 for black. So yeah, if you want to preserve the right to castle, the only option is to self-pin here and defend with the knight. I thought he might take and force the doubled pawns, which I would be somewhat okay with. I mean, bishop for knight is the middle game, as we've talked about several times here on the channel. The sort of fear here when unpinning the knight and getting into this castle is that he's already put his queen on your king side. So there is a healthy attack already built up over there, and that sort of makes you nervous. And you wonder if you're defeating the point of castling by moving directly into danger or directly into the kin, as we shall say, of the queen, who has already made her intentions known to attack on the king side. But has to be done here to unpin the knight, and you have a chance to get the empty file, which would end up deciding this game. Okay, so after the castle to unpin, he castles as well. If I were playing the opposite side's pieces, I might have delayed this. And the computer doesn't seem to have a strong opinion. He thinks that castling was plus 3.8. At this point, white is up huge, according to the computer analysis. I felt pretty good because there's a good battle going on in the center of the board. I felt good despite the knight pin and despite having to castle where his queen is, because there's a good battle going on in the center of the board. And I'm going to win a couple of these minor pieces, depending upon what he decides. But the issue here, after he decides to castle, it's not that his bishop is hanging, because he is, of course, going to have an opportunity to recapture with that knight. But recapturing with the knight might have been a mistake, right? Because he's going to get that knight, he's going to get that bishop either way. If he takes the knight on move 12 rather than the bishop, the knight here on c6, then I am forced to either recapture the bishop or save my own bishop. As it stands here, I get out of the way, and I'm only down a bishop as opposed to being down both a bishop and a knight, which I could have been if he decides to take the knight on c6. Of course, if he decides to take the knight on c6, I would have recaptured the bishop. So it's kind of the same either way. He is up a bishop on the exchange. But I've got more material on the board, and in this case, this knight is going to end up forking him here. So the rooks are both forked. He thinks he has compensation for it for the empty file by the empty file. But here's one of those rare occasions. I mean, actually on all occasions, but it can be hard to sort of calculate when you have rooks connected, which rook should be captured if you're on the attack or offensive, which rook to defend if you're on the defensive, or with which rook to take the empty file. So if he moves his queenside rook to e1 rather than his kingside rook on this move here, well, he would prevent his rooks from being forked as they ended up being. So that is what we would call a blunder, and ends up losing a rook. But crucially here, the move is to take the queenside rook and not the kingside rook, because if you take the queenside rook, he's forced to recapture with his rook, and thus you have a chance to gain control of the empty file. So we'll watch it play out. The computer thinks this move is the blunder, which, I can understand it, but I think it's a relatively computer calculation and not necessarily a human intuition. The recapture here would have given him the empty file, but he would have had to relinquish this empty file anyway when I captured the rook on a1. So this is what happened here. He ends up keeping the pawn, the passed pawn on the kingside pawn on the e file rather than recapturing in the hopes of promoting. I move my queen out to block it. He pushes one move forward, which was an interesting idea, giving him an attacking chance here that would put a check on my king and double attack from the rook and queen. But here's a move that I was roughly proud of fouling. I mean, as you can see from the computer analysis here, this little bar going down means that his most pivotal blunder of the game was this one. Again, it's a computer insight to understand the difference between moving to e5 and capturing here on d4. But this move ended up being pivotal, right? Because instead of recapturing, which seems almost obvious, but also gives this rook a chance to recapture here on e6 with a protected square because the queen is sitting there. Instead, I move around it. I attack the queen with protection on the pawn coming from the rook. He's forced to get out of here. Computer wants him to move all the way back to d1. He doesn't see that. The move back to d1 would have allowed him to recapture when this eventual rook capture comes, recapture with his queen as opposed to the rook, and thus relinquishing the empty file. Here we go. He moves only one square back, wanting to keep up the pressure on this king side. I mean, this king side pressure that we were worried about when we ended up castling from the first ends up being his sort of downfall. We're talking about Chris 329, 1629 rated player right now. Because he didn't have enough material on the king side to put this pressure. To back up in the game a little bit on move 13, we push this pawn to c4, or pawn to bishop 5 if you're into the old school annotation and language for the game, which can be quite poetic sometimes. Anyway, moving this pawn to c4 traps the bishop, and traps the bishop on the queen side. He doesn't really have anywhere to go to get out of this, and this bishop is the only safe square it has to go to is here on d7. And he could do that, and he will eventually do that in order to get out of this pressure. But a lot of times, this trapping, when you trap either a bishop or a queen on one side or one corner of the board, because you can't really trap a knight in the same way because their lines of movement can't be obstructed in the same way. Again, that's a knight for bishop trade-off that you think about in the middle game. A lot of times, this bishop, fast forward to the ending, this bishop is still right here. Now, it wouldn't stay here the whole game. This bishop goes on a little bishop's tour. You see knight's tour often. You don't see bishop's tour. But these extra movements that the bishop has to make in order to avoid danger, 21, bishop to d7, or 22, bishop to e6, which is a check. But all of these little movements that the bishop has to make in order to avoid basically the suffocating pressure on the queen side costs your opposition tempo. And so, like I said, fast forward to this ending, the bishop is still here, which again is the poetics of chess. The bishop is still on b5 or bishop on knight 4. If you're reading again with the old school descriptive language, it's still here, and so it never ends up getting captured. But all of the moves it had to make to avoid being pinned behind this pawn here on c4 end up costing the opponent tempo, and tempo can turn to material pretty easily. Again, in this end game, I'm up 2 pawns, and I have a rook as opposed to a bishop and a knight. So, as you often see when you really start to analyze thoroughly, pawn structure and pawn skeleton, it is one of the static features of the game that moves from middle game to end game. So if you want to understand the board, if you want to understand the chess match and what happened, look at the pawns, because they are the skeleton of board position and because they are the soul of chess. If you want to understand what happened in this game, you look at the pawns, look at his bishop being trapped. You think, okay, is he going to be able to save the bishop? He did save the bishop, but what was the cost? The cost of saving the bishop was tempo. So this bishop being trapped over here ended up being one of the decisive features of the game, as did the open or semi-open E file. Bang, after recapture here on move 17, knight takes rook a1. He has to recapture here. There goes his passed pawn. The empty file is now mine. He responds by throwing the queen, asking for a queen exchange. I'm up 1 at this point. Thank you for the queen exchange. And this is just a matter of execution, especially with this bishop trapped here. His bishop was dead, and he could have, maneuvered the pawn back to an empty file or maneuvered this rook here to try to take the semi-open file and deal with my passed pawn, but he elected to try to save it, and saving it cost tempo. I'm able to start to move my pawns and rooks down the board. Happy to exchange when you're up +1 like this. This was a blunder on my part. Missed a double attack between the bishop and king, which could have ended the game earlier. But at this point, again, that bishop able to retake a pawn, but doesn't end up being enough to compensate for the lost tempo, which translated into lost material. And then again, like I said, pawn to a2 or pawn to rook 7 in the descriptive notation would end up being decisive. White resigns, and that, as they say, it was the ball game. And then felt I like a watcher of the sky when a new planet swims into his kin. That's all for today. Happy birthday, Matulu. Command, Control, Escape. Have a great day.